Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm joined here today by Alastair Stewart, who's a senior consultant and QSA here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today, Alastair and I are going to be talking about preparing for a PCI DSS version 4.0 assessment. So Alastair, my first question for you is, what types of evidence does PCI DSS version 4 require?
Hi Annie. Yeah. When they've released the version 4 standard a couple of years ago, they didn't really. They stuck to the same sorts of evidence they had before. So there are 4 key types of evidence that have always really been required for PCI DSS assessments, and those are documentation, policies, processes, procedures, those kind of things that are sort of written down and documented formally within the business. There is observations of processes happening, so observing people logging on, observing configurations of servers and those kind of things. There are interviews with staff members to discuss the processes and procedures and make sure they understand them and they can talk about them as they do them, and collecting samples. So there are samples of logging systems, samples of alerts and samples of change tickets and these kind of things. So a sample of things that you might have outputs from a particular process or procedure. And most of the requirements need multiple types of evidence to assess. So we might look at your process for adding new users to the system. We'll then observe going through that process of adding them, and we'll talk to the people who add those new users and put those permissions in to make sure they understand the process, and probably take some samples of where you've done that, where you've added new users, and we'll take screenshots, etc., to prove all that. So those are the types of evidence that we collect, and it's usually multiple types for the requirements.
Are any of those types of evidence new for version 4.0? Has it introduced any new types of evidence?
No, all the types are the same. What has changed is that some requirements have had new types added where they didn't have before, and some of them they've taken types away or amalgamated them into different things. So whereas before it might have been just an observation, they might now say actually it's better to do this via interview or via a combination of documentation and samples or something. So the core types haven't changed, but which ones you may be asked for have differed within the version 4 standard.
So can companies prepare any evidence before their assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. We encourage it from all our clients to get ahead of the game when it comes to actual assessment time. Obviously, documentation, policies, all that kind of stuff can be collated and sent through because they're just either spreadsheets or Word documents. So they can easily be prepared in advance. Knowing what wants to be observed can be very handy because if we're going to want to observe an administrator log onto a particular server, you may need to tee up some security changes to make that happen in advance to make it easier. You may need to grant somebody extra access they didn't have before in order to show something. So knowing what's going to be observed is always useful. And obviously lining up who's going to be interviewed about what topic, which staff member is going to be able to talk the best about each given topic. The only thing you can't really prepare for is samples, because the assessor will probably want to select the samples themselves rather than let you choose what he sees or he or her sees. So a lot of it can be prepared and should be prepared in advance.
So just looking at any changes in collecting evidence, how did QSAs collect evidence before and previous versions of the PCI DSS?
So there were 2 key ways that evidence was collected. The first was with documentation and with sample sets. They were simply entered as line items in an evidence table. So you'd list what the document was, you'd give it a reference, you'd list the date it was reviewed, or the sample set, you'd list what was in that sample and what type of sample they were. And then each requirement that needed that evidence would simply reference whichever document or sample set it was. All the other evidence types were described within each requirement. So we would have to type up and describe how we observed an administrator log on or summarize what we interviewed the person about with the relevant details for that requirement, which meant that the typical process was stepping through the requirements, documenting the evidence as we went through the sessions, usually meaning that multiple sessions were needed with the same team or with similar people, because we'd go through requirement 1, and then when we go through requirement 2, we'd have to pull the same people back in again. It could also mean that sometimes evidence got missed because it wasn't covered in one of the sessions, and so during the sort of mop-up period afterwards, we'd have to go back and schedule some extra sessions with people to collect any of the evidence we've missed. So it was done in a sort of two styles. One was line items referencing, and the other was documenting as you went through the sessions.
And what's different about how it's collected in version 4?
So in version 4, everything is standardized to line items in tables. So you've got a table for documents, you've got a table for samples. The interview table now includes the descriptions of what was interviewed in that line item with that person or persons. And the observations and other stuff is all documented in line items with reference numbers. And simply each requirement, you just call on reference numbers as to what was referenced. So if the requirement requires a document and interview, you just put the reference in of the documents and interviews that you've already entered in the previous evidence sessions. So everything's standardized into one way of collecting evidence, no matter what that type of evidence is.
Seems like a little bit more of a sensible way of doing things. Is that going to be more straightforward for organisations to pull off?
Yeah, absolutely. What it really means is that with the correct amount of planning, you can collect and document all the different types of evidence in one session with the relevant people, enter them all as line items into the table, and then simply go through and reference it later on. So you can go through the requirements and go, well, actually, I'm just referring back to the same interview every time, rather than having to type up in one requirement what you talked about in the interview for that requirement, and then in a later one what you talked about in the same interview for a different requirement. You just summarize it all in one go in the session, and then simply reference it whenever it's needed. So it should be much simpler to process that evidence through those sessions.
Yeah, definitely. Looking at how the assessment itself might differ, how will these changes affect the assessment?
So obviously, I just mentioned that you're going to document everything in one session. So what should realistically happen is, with the right amount of planning and preparation, you should be able to schedule one probably slightly longer session with each person or teams of people and collect all the evidence that they can give you, both the interviews, the observations and sample sets, all in that one session. And then I, as a QSA or the assessor, can simply work through that afterwards and go, well, I need to reference that same session or that same piece of evidence for each of these requirements, meaning that there shouldn't be multiple sessions, and hopefully you won't miss anything, and you shouldn't have to go back and schedule other sessions later on where you've missed stuff, because you hopefully just document it all in one place rather than having to jump around the standard to different requirements.
Have you got like a key piece of advice for organisations when preparing for an assessment?
Work with your QSA ultimately to plan those sessions. So you should be able to go through the requirements with your QSA. You should be able to sort of detail through the requirements and go, well, all of these requirements are going to need to be given by this team, the infrastructure team or the networks team or whoever it is that can give these evidence, but go through the whole standard first rather than one at a time, so that when you get the session with that infrastructure team, you can do all the observations, all the interviews and everything documented in one session. The assessor can just type it all up there and then go away and do it later. So you can then plan the appropriate number of sessions and make sure you've got the appropriate length of sessions. You can also work with your assessor to select sample sets in advance. If you can send through the asset registers of what servers and stuff you've got, you can plan with the assessor and say, right, well, these are the sample sets, these are the servers we're going to look at, these are the change tickets we want, so that when you get to that session with those guys, they're prepared to show specific servers, and they've had all the time to prepare and know exactly what's coming. There should be no surprises in the sessions then, meaning it should theoretically be a lot quicker. Admittedly, that's probably only true of subsequent assessments. If you transition from version 3 to version 4, that probably is going to take longer because of the change of planning and the change in way it's done. But then subsequently, year on year, it should be much simpler and more efficient to do when you're redoing a version 4 rather than going to your first year of version 4. That's certainly what we found with our clients anyway.
With the SAQ, the self-assessment questionnaire, For those merchants that are self-assessing and doing that SAQ, what has changed in the questionnaire?
Okay, so again, the evidence types have remained the same. What evidence is required for each requirement has changed accordingly as it has with assessments. So the SAQs match up directly with the actual assessment stuff that we do. Just obviously it's shrunk down for each self-assessment questionnaire. The actual questionnaires themselves haven't had any eligibility changes. We often get this question an awful lot. What's changed on my SAQ? You're still going to be on the same SAQ. Nothing will change from that point of view. If your scope's the same, it's the same SAQ. They have added new requirements to nearly all of the SAQs, ranging from a couple up to about 20 or 30 on some of the other ones that have had a lot of changes. And some of the requirements have been taken away because they weren't particularly relevant. So my advice is pretty much just go through your SAQ for version 4 and try and line up with the previous version and go, what extra do we now have to evidence that we didn't have to evidence before? That might take some planning because you might not have looked at the requirements before. You might not have considered those requirements because they weren't on it before. So do check. They have all had at least a few added somewhere along the line.
Which SAQs sort of seen the highest number of new requirements?
So SAQ-C has probably seen, I think it saw about 40 added, which was quite a lot. And that one's specific to an environment whereby you're taking payments on a desktop or a laptop via an application that's installed specifically for the purpose of taking payments. So it usually only fits a sort of call center environment or a shop environment that's got specific installed applications. It's not a common SAQ. I will say that a lot of our clients don't use it because it's very specific. Probably the most impactful one is on the SAQ-A, which is the smallest questionnaire and the one that most of our clients aim for because it's the smallest and applies to e-commerce merchants, which is nearly all of our clients. It's only had about 10 requirements added, but because it was a very small SAQ to start with, those 10 requirements have made quite a difference, including now having to do quarterly ASV vulnerability scans, which you didn't have to do before. So there's an ongoing task of scanning a website that was never required. So although it's not got the most added, it's probably the most impactful to the most of our clients.
What about changes for service providers?
Yes, this was an interesting one. When they first released version 4, they didn't plan to have an SAQ for service providers anymore. They planned to ditch it and ask service providers to complete the full report on compliance that we would normally complete themselves, which was a slightly mad idea because that's a very big, complicated document to fill out. What they ended up compromising with was having the SAQ for service providers come back, but increasing its detail greatly. So they extensively changed the scoping section with a lot more detail, so the service provider has to provide clear, concise information on exactly what is their service they provide and how that's in scope of PCI DSS. And all the requirements now have an explanation box. On normal SAQs, they don't. You simply tick yes, no, not applicable. The service provider one, whichever answer you give to a requirement, you have a box and you have to detail why you gave that answer. So it gives a lot more transparency and detail to service providers compliance, because it can be very complex to understand exactly what each business does, because services can vary wildly from one provider to another, and so they want to try and give as much detail as possible. So if you are a service provider self-assessing, be aware you can have a lot of detailed documentation work in your future when it comes to your self-assessment.
Have the PCI DSS, have they added any new SAQs?
They didn't initially, they didn't plan to, but they did actually release one about a year after version 4 came out called the SAQ SPOC. They like acronyms, so SPOC stands for Software-Based Pin Entry on COTS, which has got acronyms within acronyms. Essentially, if you've ever got in a taxi or you've gone to a market stall trader, you'll often see these new types of setups whereby they've got a little tiny card reader device and it Bluetooth links to their mobile phone and uses that to connect to the internet and make the payments. It's very popular amongst those sort of people because it's very simple and easy and they could just use it with any mobile phone. This SAQ is specifically designed for that merchant type setup so that they can use their own personal mobile phone. The COTS is a commercial off-the-shelf mobile device. They don't have to worry about a specific dedicated secure mobile device that has to be patched up and all the rest of it. They can use any mobile device they like, and provided the solution is a validated solution that's been validated by the council as able to be used in those setups, they don't have to worry about securing their mobile device. They simply deploy it onto the mobile device and it functions and is secure without them having to do a lot of effort and work around the actual mobile device, which nobody wants to do because it's their personal mobile. You don't want to lock it all down and tighten it all up. So you need to be using a solution that's validated for the SBOC standard, and then you get to fill out this SAQ, which is largely related to the physical security of the device and how you've deployed the software onto your mobile phone. So for those kind of people, taxis, market or traders and smaller traders, it's going to be a great help to allow them to comply, because before they'd be on a big full SAQD and it was a lot of effort and work which wasn't really commensurate to the sort of level of transaction volume they're taking on those devices.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Alastair. And for any of our listeners that want to learn a little bit more about this topic, we've got an amazing blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, called Preparing for a PCI DSS version 4.0 assessment, which just covers a lot of these points and goes into some detail in other areas as well. So please do go and check that out. And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.